I welcome you to our continuing study of Paul's letter to the churches of Galatia. Today we're going to be focusing on the fourth chapter, a chapter that contains a variety of different kind of themes, one of those being Paul's continuing to talk about the Galatians as children of God. We're going to also then move into a section where Paul is sharing about his care for the Galatian Christian community. It is a section that contains both confrontation as well as intimacy, and gives a variety of different kind of perspectives related to how Paul is feeling and thinking about the Galatian Christians as they struggle with the teachings that he had given them and the teachings that is being provided by the missionaries who are providing what he considers to be a false doctrine. Then we're going to be moving into a section which is a complicated one based upon Paul's analogy of Hagar, the concubine of Abraham, and also Sarah, the wife of Abraham, and their offspring, and how Paul sees that as a particular images of how it is that the missionaries have misinterpreted that, and how he wants to set the record straight for the Galatian Christians. However, before we do all that, let's take a look at some of the responses that we have received from those who had responded to our work on chapter 3 of our last session. Let me read to you from Linda. This is probably the hardest chapter so far that I have studied in Galatians. In the first two chapters, I have seen Paul angry and sharp-tongued in his comments to the Galatians. But in this chapter, he's abrasive and harsh. In my opinion, the Galatians turned back from the work of the Holy Spirit to the anti-gospel based on law and works for the same reason that we today continue to focus on good works as a means to get to heaven. Rather than putting our faith in Jesus Christ, we continue to try for salvation by keeping a record of the good versus the bad that we do. We need to stop trying to control things and place our faith in the grace of Jesus Christ. The manner of circumcision required by God for Abraham and the male members of his household in Genesis baffles me. It says that it was part of a covenant between Abraham and God. I've looked for an explanation in several sources, but for the most part, the sources stated it was deemed a barbaric act of mutilation and an extremely dangerous procedure. Others state that it was to distinguish the Jews from the Gentiles. To set them apart from this is the case why would God have told Abraham that he would be the father of all nations. Perhaps Cliff, Lorelei and Joe and others may be more helpful with this subject. A last thought that just came to me is maybe it was a test from God to see how faithful Abraham really was. Perhaps he wished to test him like when he asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. We move on then to some comments from Joe, who says, number one, I think Paul would not have been surprised at the reversion of the Galatians. Here were people, like I imagine all people of the time, who grew up believing that one gets God's favor through the following of law. That is the Old Testament. Understanding, for me, that relates to today's, it's what we've always known to be true, or the way we've always done it. I believe current theory about making a change is it takes 30 days of doing it for the change to stick. I found that even after 30 days, it only takes 1 day for me to revert back to my old ways. Maybe I'm harder to teach. So the Galatians may have needed someone with them as their coach to keep them consciously thinking and behaving and following the new belief. She states number 2, Abraham lived in a time of the belief system of following law, especially in circumcising he and his male children. Yet, when he was directed by God, he followed God's will, even if that meant going against law. In the instance of offering Isaac as an offering, I find it kind of a juxtaposition that God's will was for Abraham to follow customs held by the church, quote, of law, end of quote. The NIV version reads the law was an attached addendum to God's will for Abraham. The purposes of the law was to keep a sinful people in the way of salvation until Christ, the descendant, came. So Abraham, in direct communication with God, was a man of faith who happened to live in a world where the belief system he followed made him a man of the law. I added a little bit here. That was the difficulty that Paul faced as well, Joe. Let's move on to some comments from Cliff. On question 1, change takes time and effort. Paul has asked them to give up what they had learned over years. He'd asked them to think different thoughts and see with different eyes. That he has written a letter to them is evidence that he was not there with them to shepherd them in his teaching. That they slid back to old thinking is understandable. Paul is fighting inertia. The work of the Spirit may not have been as obvious to the Galatians as it was to Paul. The Galatians had been value programmed, and change would not come without a significant emotional event. As Dr. Morris Macy described in his video lecture, "What you are is what you were when." The difference is how Paul and the Galatians arrived at this point of having faith in Jesus Christ are important for assessing how well they have internalized this new way of believing. Cliff goes on, I can see parallels between Jesus and the apostles and Paul and the church of Galatia. As they traveled together and Jesus taught the apostles, there seemed to be those instances where they just didn't get it. Jesus taught humility and service, yet they argued about who would be greatest. Paul taught the Galatians and how he is rebuking them for straying from that teaching. Cliff writes on question 2, after Abraham freed his nephew Lot and refused to take the spoils of battle, God made the covenant of greatness with Abram, that he would have descendants as numerous as the stars. God assured Abram that his heir would not be a slave born in his house. Abram believed God, and God deemed that belief as righteousness. Later, after the birth of Ishmael, God repeated the covenant. God then said that circumcision would be a sign of the covenant. It was Abraham's belief that was righteousness rather than the circumcision. Let's go on to some comments from Lorelei. She comments on question 1. She says, I choose the first question to reflect on as it resonates with me. In my opinion, the reason the Galatians turn from the work of the Spirit to law and works is for the same reason me and many others get sidetracked spiritually, immaturity. As Reverend Don Gribble used to say, I don't know nothing yet. Accepting that Jesus has purchased my freedom, chapter 3, verse 13, is an evolving process. Prior teaching and understanding cling to me. It often takes time and time and time. Sometimes, like the Galatians, I need a Paul or a Don Gribble or an Ed Grove to remind me I am free of curses and condemnation. Mary Beth writes to us on question 1. First, I wonder if all of the Galatian Christian converts had turned away from Paul's teaching. Did the entire Christian population, parenthesis, are you people in Galatia mad, turn back to following Jewish law, or was it only a portion of them? Second, I wonder about Paul's reaction toward what he heard was happening in Galatia. Was he being too quick to judge, impatient, unrealistic, or naive? How well did Paul's understanding human nature, habitual behavior, the need for continual reinforcement? I thought back on my experiences with the Jesus Freaks movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Young people were immersed in the Jesus movement, celebrating the birthday of Jesus with gatherings and cakes and singing. Happy birthday, dear Jesus. A strong, charismatic energy was moving among young adults on college campuses with very public witnessing, singing, and worship. However, this intense devotion to Jesus soon faded. I believe that if Paul were one of the Jesus movement leaders, he probably have written quite a few scolding letters to the born-again Christians back then as well. Paul wasn't a psychologist. The only human psyche he understood was his own, and wow, did that change. So, from a persecutor of the word to a preacher of the word, Paul experienced a radical change in his attitude and behavior. This he could understand because it happened to him. Despite Paul's sharing, teaching, guiding, instilling, preaching, witnessing, exemplifying Christian principles to people who had been raised to practice the Mosaic law that was practiced for generations upon generations, it's no wonder that, as Cliff worded it, people of Galatia slid back to old thinking. You see, new life requires consistent guidance, training, affirmation, and support. Paul left them. He wasn't there when they needed these things. Rather, he berated them for not maintaining their new faith in the Spirit of Christ on their own. Hello, Paul. These are young Christians. The newness of believing in the Spirit of Jesus Christ started wearing off, and you weren't there to redirect them and to support them. Just saying, Mary Beth. All of our writers are pointing out that the idea of Paul's absence from the Galatian community was an important issue, that there was a sense of unfairness on his part at believing that the teachings that he had instilled in them would be maintained without some constant affirmation, support, guidance, and care. And I find that an interesting common theme among those who have written back to us and helped us to understand that Paul may be a bit unfair, that his lack of presence with them had a greater impact than he might have believed. Well, let's turn our attention now to chapter 4 and a serious look at how it is that the Apostle Paul is responding to the Galatian community. As noted at the outset, we're looking at a variety of different kind of themes today with Paul's response. The first of them is in verses 1 down through 7, where Paul's continuing a theme of their understanding that the Galatian Christians' understanding that they really are children of God. Whether they be Jew or whether they be Gentile, it is not important to him. What is important is that they understand that in spite of all that is being taught, that their being a part of the community of faith is profoundly secure. Paul, in these verses, goes back to an analogy that he has used on other occasions, the idea of childhood, and what happens from the immaturity of childhood on one side to becoming of age on another. In these verses, Paul uses that same model, if you would, to indicate that children, at least in his own culture, lived under a very strict code of conduct, under strict rules, under strict guidance. Children were, in some ways, Paul says, even like slaves, because they needed guidance, they needed laws, they needed discipline, they needed direction. And so, therefore, the law was appropriate for them in that childhood moment. However, when Jesus comes, that becomes the moment of when the children move from their childhood experience into their adult experience. And just as in the culture, children, when they come of age, are given a sense of freedom, a sense of responsibility, a sense of being adopted into the community in a whole new way, Paul sees that is true for the Galatian Christians as well. In fact, for all Christians, whether they be a Galatian or not, that in our childhood, in those early days when we had to live under strict guidance and strict guidelines, we are set free at the point that we become an adult, when we become the age of responsibility. And so for Paul, then at this moment, he realizes that the coming of Jesus Christ has set the Galatian children free, and that they are no longer bound by the old law. They're no longer bound by the old guidance, but they are now accepted into the full family of God. They're accepted fully and completely as responsible and caring adults, and therefore they can take their place rightfully in the whole family. And the law is no longer necessary. The guidelines are no longer necessary because they now live in a whole new status. Paul then moves on, starting at verse 8 and going down through verse 20. In a whole section in this 4th chapter about his concern and his care for the Galatians. And it's an interesting section because it's a mixture of all kind of emotions and expressions. In verses 8 through 11, the first part of that, Paul goes very quickly into his reprimanding mode, his taking them to task. He notes that at one time, their ignorance and their resulting behavior was because they were still children or slaves under the law. But now they're adults, and they don't live that way any longer. And so in some ways, relying back on verses 1 through 7, he's saying in verses 8 down through 11 that they are now set free, and they should understand that. That's what he taught them, that they are no longer bound by the old law. They are no longer bound by that which had happened in the past, but they were, because of the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, they were set free. And so why was it then that they were reverting back to the old law? Did they want to go back into slavery again? Did they want to go back into their childhood behavior again? Did they want to revert to what they used to be? Why did they not accept this whole new gift of freedom and responsible life that was offered to them in Jesus Christ? And so there is a challenge to them at this point is, why did you forget? Why did you turn your back? Why did you listen? Why were you so susceptible to believing this teaching, this false doctrine from the missionaries? He ends that with a very graphic kind of thing. He said, sometimes I think I've wasted my effort on you. And there is a very poignant kind of issue of the exasperated, frustrated parent who believes that everything that they had taught their child, everything that they had encouraged them to do, everything that they had helped them to become, they'd forgotten, and they'd turned their back and walked away. And then in verses 12 down through 20, in this whole section of Paul's concern for the Galatians, we discover a whole different side of Paul. This is a section that is a combination of both intimacy on one side, and frankly, some information is presented here for which we really don't have a whole lot of background. But he shares with them very clearly something about his own history, his own life. He says to them, I want you to become like I am. I want you to understand the model that I present to you. Now, in some ways, this may sound to us like a rather high ego, but frankly, it is a style that was utilized by many teachers in the time of Paul. Great spiritual leaders often used themselves as models of what it is that they were seeking to teach their students. And so Paul was following in that same line. And he's saying to the Galatian Christians, when I came to you, I came as one who had formerly been a Jew, but I had lived under the law, had understood the law. But when I came to you, I came as one who had put all of that aside, and I was living only and fully and completely in the grace of God. And it is that model that is profoundly important to them. This is who I used to be, and I put it away. I'm no longer the slave child. I'm no longer one bound under the law. I'm one now that lives under the full freedom of the grace that has been offered in Jesus Christ. Paul is witnessing to his own radical transformation and is offering to them himself as a model. He goes on then to say, some things that are a bit confusing for us. He talks about his coming to them in their in weakness, that he was somehow injured, he was in need of help, and they accepted him graciously and wonderfully. And here we get a really interesting perspective of how it is that when Paul originally appeared to the Galatian community, apparently he was in a pretty difficult place in his life. He appeared to them with kind of two things. One was a profound message of the grace of God, to be sure, but also a body that was sick, injured, broken. We're not sure. He came to them physically needing help. He came to them in a position of needing the understanding and grace of people who would look after him, and they did. And so he uses this whole perspective of saying to them how gracious and how wonderful it was that when I came to you originally, in my first journey to you, when I preached the gospel to you, I was in a bad place, and you took me in. You took me in, you cared for me, you looked after my need, you would have given anything for me. And so he's putting his finger on this absolutely wonderful passion that the Galatian Christians had for him as their teacher and preacher and leader at that initial moment when the churches were being founded. And so he's looking back at that period, And there's a sense of absolute grace and joy at remembering that. But then it turns, because he says, have you forgotten? Has it become something where I, who was once so important to you, have now become your enemy? And so clearly Paul is addressing the fact that his credibility among them seems to have been weakened, and he is sorely hurt by that. His teaching obviously is being undermined, and he is frustrated by that. And he's comparing those moments when he first came to the Galatian Christian community and preached to them powerfully and wonderfully, the grace of the risen Christ. But at the same time, came to them as a people who were offering him their grace and their care. In that, Paul then ends this particular section by saying to them very clearly and very specifically how it is that how he wished that he could still be with them. And so we go back to something that was being picked up by our commentators in the very first section, and looking back at chapter 3, where there is some sadness and some weakness on Paul's part at not continuing to be with the Christian community of Galatia. And now he's looking back at sadness. No, he's not there. And that even his writing the letter is a rather weak attempt at communicating all that was important to him. He uses a childbirth image very interestingly in verse 19. He says, "My dear children, for whom I am again in the pains of childbirth, until Christ is fully formed in you." And recognizing that they're growing and that he's not there to help them. And so maybe my friends who wrote your comments earlier on, Paul did get it. And that this was not just a letter of anger, but also maybe a letter with some guilt attached as well. That he's not there to continue to nurture them. In the latter part of this chapter, starting at verse 21 and going down through the end of it, Paul is now taking on very particularly two groups. One are the missionaries themselves who are teaching false doctrine. The others are those who are believing that, who are following that. And he is turning into a very, very strong lecturer on the law here and on the history of Israel. And again, the underground and underguiding theme here of Paul is you are children of God by faith. Faith in Abraham, or in the line of Abraham. Children of this Abraham who believed and faith, and it was counted to him as righteousness, as we find in Genesis 15, verse 6. For here, though, he launches into a discussion of two of the women of Abraham's life. One of them is Hagar. Hagar, his concubine, by whom he has Ishmael. And the other one, then, is Sarah. Now, it is important to understand that the idea of using these two as models is the way in which they were given birth to their particular children. Hagar was given as over to Abram as one to just bear a child, and it became a very important issue that this child would become an heir. So this one is a very common sexually oriented birth, one that was born out of the culture of the time. On the other hand, Sarah, the one he loved so profoundly, but who had no children. And the idea that finally, then when God appears into their life and says to Sarah, you are going to have a child, and that is a promise. And so those two ways of understanding how God was moving in their life and world became very important, both to the missionaries and to Paul. Isaac is a child of promise. God was present. God was with Sarah. God was there with Abraham and Sarah to even in your old age, I'm going to fulfill with you a child. And so that idea of the promise, the looking forward of God's presence in that is profoundly important. Hagar has a child out of expedience, one where they took matters into their own hands. You don't have an heir, so here's my handmaiden. Have a child by her, and you'll have an heir. And so they're very different stories. And those different stories become profoundly important. The missionaries interpreted in one way, and Paul interprets it in another. And here becomes again one of the stories of the Great Divide. On one side, we see the missionaries saying that Hagar was indeed a child of God who provided the gift of life, but she was the one who gave life to the Gentiles. And because Abraham sent her away, sent her and Ishmael away, they were not partakers in the covenant. On the other hand, Sarah was the one who bore the gift of life and became the heir of the law. And so for the missionaries, Sarah represents the heritage of the law, and Hagar represents the life of Gentiles who live outside the covenant. And so for the missionaries, in order for Gentiles to become a part of the covenant, they needed to now abide by Jewish law, circumcision, obedience to festival days, dietary laws, all that goes with that. And so for the missionaries, their teaching to the Gentiles at the Gentile Christian church in Galatia was, if you want to be a part of the covenant, you've got to buy into being a part of the line of Sarah, not Hagar. Paul, on the other hand, interprets this in a whole different way. In Paul's thinking, Sarah is the one who is the child of the promise, faith. Hagar, and here it becomes a bit confusing, and somehow we're not sure how Paul gets at this, but Paul attaches Hagar to the Mosaic covenant at Mount Sinai, that she's kind of the bearer of the law. And so Paul reverses it. Hagar is the bearer of the law, and Sarah is the bearer of faith and promise and righteousness. And so he takes the argument of the missionaries and totally turns it around, turns it upside down. And that where they saw Sarah as the child of law and Hagar as the one who lived outside of covenant, Paul reinterprets it to say that Hagar is the one who is the bearer of law and therefore of slavery under the law. And Sarah is the one who is the child of faith and the child of righteousness. And so he totally turns it around to help the Galatian Christians to understand that they really do not need to abide by the law. They need to live in the faith that has been offered to them through Abraham and carried on in joy by Sarah.
Show me your way. Help me keep my mind on you. I will do what you want me to, Lord. Show me your way. Oh Lord, show me your way. Mold my heart in your will, I'm praying. Let me hear what your Spirit's saying, Lord. Show me your way. Help me keep my mind on you. I will do what you want me to, Lord. Show me your way. Oh Lord, show me your way. For the way of the Lord is perfect, and the way of the Lord is pure. Oh, the way of the Lord is holy, and his righteousness endures. Hold my heart in your will, I'm praying. Let me hear what your Spirit's saying, Lord. Show me your way. Help me keep my mind on you. I will do what you want me to, Lord. Show me your way. Oh Lord, show me your way. For the way of the Lord is perfect, and the way of the Lord is pure. Oh, the way of the Lord is holy, and his righteousness endures. Hold my heart in your will, I'm praying. Let me hear what your Spirit's saying, Lord. Show me your way. Help me keep my mind on you. I will do what you want me to, Lord. Show me your way. Oh Lord, show me your way. Oh Lord, show me your way. Oh Lord, show me your way.
Thank you for being a part of our study of Paul's letter to the churches of Galatia. It's been an interesting time discovering the insights and teachings and counsel of this apostle of the church. As we move forward, I'm asking that you would respond to us, letting us know whether or not this study has been helpful. A quick email to the email that is noted below would be very helpful, giving us some guidance on whether or not we can continue this format into the future, or whether or not there are some different models that we would like to use. Some have suggested using Zoom along the way. If that is an option for you, would you also email that and let us know that as well? Thank you, and may God bless you as we continue to study the Word that has been offered to us.